I parked outside my sister's house, staring at the warm light spilling from the windows. Everything looked calm, inviting even, but my chest was tight, my stomach twisting in knots. I shouldn't care what they think. I really shouldn't. I've told myself that 1,000 times. Yet, every time I step through that door, I feel like a visitor in my own life, like I'm walking into a place where I'm always being measured and found lacking. The sound of laughter and clinking silverware drifted through the partially open window, and I could smell the roast, rich and spicy, mingling with the faint perfume my sister must have put on. A normal family dinner, I reminded myself. Ordinary, nothing to stress over. And yet, I hesitated at the threshold, one hand on the doorknob, the other fidgeting with the strap of my bag. I let myself imagine how the evening would unfold. My parents would sit at their usual spots, exchanging thin smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Cousins I barely recognized would chatter over trivial things, and somewhere, my sister would be glowing with that effortless happiness that always made me feel smaller. As I pushed open the door, I forced a smile and took a slow breath. The warmth hit me immediately, both comforting and suffocating, like I was stepping into a memory I'd never been allowed to fully inhabit. The smell of roasted meat hit me again, stronger this time, and my stomach gave a nervous flip. My mind whispered reminders. It's just dinner. You're just here to enjoy yourself. Don't overthink it. I walked in, my steps careful, almost tentative, scanning the room. My family glanced up, polite nods and murmured greetings, nothing hostile yet. But I felt their eyes, the weight of expectations and judgments, pressing down like invisible hands. I tried to shrug it off, told myself I wasn't here to prove anything. But the truth? My stomach felt like lead, and my heart was already bracing for the usual avalanche of subtle criticisms and unspoken comparisons, somewhere behind the laughter. I could hear my sister's voice, warm and familiar, calling me over. I moved toward her, a tight smile plastered on my face, trying to remind myself that maybe tonight could be different. Maybe tonight, I could just exist here without the constant reminder that, in this family, I was always less that I slid into. My seat at the long, polished dining table, trying to ignore the faint squeak of the chair under me. Around me, people I barely knew were laughing at jokes I didn't understand, their eyes flicking over me occasionally with that curious mix of politeness and judgment. It wasn't hostility exactly, it was worse. It was the kind of scrutiny that makes you feel like you're being measured against some invisible checklist you'll never pass. I ran a hand over the cold, smooth surface of the table, feeling the weight of the silverware, the crisp folds of the napkin beneath my fingers. The smell of the roast was stronger here, mingled with the scent of buttered bread and roasted vegetables. Somewhere near me, someone dabbed at their lips with a linen napkin, the faint fragrance of their perfume drifting across me. I wanted to focus on the food, on the warmth of the room, but my eyes kept darting to the family members I barely recognized. The cousins I vaguely remembered from past holidays were seated diagonally across from me, their laughter light but sharp, like glass tinkling. I caught a glance from my aunt, her eyes scanning me briefly before returning to her conversation. I felt the old familiar prickle in my chest, that twinge of invisibility, of being an outsider in the very circle I was born. I thought about the last time I had been here, years ago. A flashback hit me like a punch. I was 8, trying to show my parents a drawing I'd made, and my uncle had chuckled under his breath, whispering, "Why bother? It's not like anyone cares." The words had lingered longer than anyone intended. I could still feel the sting in my young heart, the way it made me shrink inside myself. And now, sitting here, that memory rose up uninvited, making me feel smaller than my chair, smaller than the room that I tried to anchor myself in the present. I told myself to breathe, to notice the sound of the silverware clinking, the hum of voices. But every laugh felt like it bounced off some invisible wall between me and everyone else, a reminder that I didn't belong here in the same way they did. My sister leaned over and whispered a small greeting, a brief warmth that reminded me I wasn't entirely invisible. I forced a smile, nodding, though my chest still felt heavy. My mind kept flicking to the empty spaces in my memory of this table, the dinners where I had been overlooked, the times I had spoken only to be interrupted or ignored. I couldn't help it. I was always anticipating the next subtle jab, the glance that said, without words, You don't matter here. And yet, somewhere beneath that familiar ache, a small, stubborn voice whispered, maybe tonight will be different. Maybe tonight, I can just sit here and exist without being measured. I held on to that thought, fragile as it was, and tried to focus on the warmth, on the smells, on the rhythm of the chatter around me. But even as I tried, the unease remained, coiling in my stomach like a living thing. The first jab came like a whisper, almost imperceptible if I hadn't been bracing for it. My cousin, leaning back in his chair with that smug, effortless grin, made a passing comment about my lack of accomplishments, framed as a joke, but the sting was immediate. I felt my jaw tighten, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. As if it could somehow anchor me in reality, that I forced a laugh that didn't reach my eyes, trying to appear lighthearted, but inside, my chest tightened with that familiar mix of hurt and irritation. The words bounced around my skull like tiny stones, each one hitting a spot that memory had already carved out. Moments from the past where I had been dismissed, ignored, or made to feel smaller, but I could feel the warmth of the room shift slightly, like the air had thickened around me. The smell of roasted meat became heavier, almost cloying, and the faint hum of chatter seemed to blur into a low, oppressive buzz. My mind raced, trying to find a way to respond without giving away just how deeply it hurt. Say something clever. Or nothing. Just sit here and swallow it like you always do. A flashback hit me hard. I was 12, sitting at a similar dinner table, proudly announcing I'd won a small writing contest at school. My aunt had shrugged, dismissing it with a quick, "That's nice, dear. But what are you really going to do with that?" The memory carried a bitter taste, a reminder that this wasn't new. It was the same script, just with new actors. That I looked around the table, scanning faces for any sign of empathy or support. My sister caught my eye for a fleeting second and gave me a small, apologetic smile. It was enough to remind me that I wasn't entirely alone, yet not enough to soothe the ache. The world seemed oddly bright outside the windows, the warm light of the house contrasting sharply with the cold weight settling in my stomach. That I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on the steam rising from my plate, the gentle clink of silverware, the faint scent of herbs in the roast. I told myself, this is nothing, just a remark, just a small, insignificant jab. But every fiber of me knew better. These were the threads woven through every gathering, every comment, every glance that had ever made me feel like I didn't belong. I forced another smile, this one tighter, sharper, with just a hint of sarcasm in it. Nice one, I thought, almost silently, as if I didn't already know. The words stayed unspoken, curling in my chest like smoke, smoldering quietly. And yet, a tiny ember of defiance sparked inside me, one I hadn't felt in years. Maybe they can say what they want, but they can't define me. I noticed him then, my sister's fiancé, sitting a few seats down, glancing at me in a way that felt different. Not judgmental, not dismissive, just curious. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that anyone looking in my direction would appear the same if I was in the corner of their vision. But there was something about the tilt of his head, the slight raise of his eyebrows, the way he shifted subtly in his chair that made my stomach twist in a new kind of tension. He pulled out his phone, not overtly, but enough for me to notice the movement. My eyes flicked toward it, then quickly away, trying not to betray my sudden anxiety. There was that quiet, unsettling thrill that always comes when someone seems genuinely interested in you. Not the fake interest I was used to from family, but something more deliberate, more focused. I forced myself to focus on the conversation around me, on the hum of chatter and the soft scrape of cutlery against plates. The smell of roasted meat and fresh herbs had shifted, sharper somehow, mingling with the faint metallic tinge of my own nervousness. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my water glass, a tiny, unnecessary motion to steady myself. Why is he looking at me like that? My mind raced. Did I do something? Say something? Or is he actually curious about me? The idea was foreign, almost dizzying. I wasn't used to being someone's focus outside of the usual judgments or passive ignoring. My family had spent years shaping me into the nobody they assumed I was. And now, across the table, someone was paying attention in a way that didn't feel like scrutiny. A flashback hit me. A brief memory of high school, of sitting alone at a cafeteria table while others whispered and laughed nearby. I remembered wishing someone, anyone, would just see me for me, not for what they assumed I lacked. And now, sitting here, years later, that same yearning flickered to life again, caught between hope and fear. He shifted his phone just slightly, enough for a glimmer of the screen to catch my peripheral vision. My chest tightened. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, the soft murmur of the room fading around me. Is he Googling me? The thought felt absurd. At first, almost intrusive, but the intensity of his attention told me it wasn't just curiosity in the ordinary sense that I swallowed hard, trying to act casual, trying to sink into the table and disappear into the background where I was supposed to belong. But the pull of his gaze, the slight tilt of his phone, kept tugging at me, making me hyper-aware of every movement, every expression. I wanted to look away, to pretend I didn't notice, but part of me was also intrigued. What does he see? I wondered. Does he see what they never did? Or is this just another performance, another illusion of attention that will fade as soon as I make a misstep? The question hung in the air, heavy and electric, and I realized that tonight, for the first time in a long time, I was uncomfortably aware that someone might actually be noticing me, not as a nobody, but as a person. It hit me like a bolt of lightning. He was Googling me, mid-dinner, right there, in plain sight, his fingers moving subtly across the screen as he scrolled, eyes widening slightly with every tap. At first, I couldn't believe it. My stomach lurched, my mouth went dry, and the familiar hum of conversation around me seemed to slow, like the world had muted itself for this one shocking moment. I tried to act casual, keeping my hands folded in my lap, forcing a smile that felt stretched too thin across my face. But inside, my mind was spinning. He's actually looking me up. Right now? What is he seeing? What does he think of me? The thought made my chest tighten, my ribs constricting with a mix of fear and anticipation I hadn't felt in years. The clinking of silverware became painfully loud. The smell of roasted meat, the rich, buttery aroma that had seemed comforting before, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel the heat rising in my face, the pulse in my neck, as I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. But the faint glow from his phone reflected in the wine glass in front of him, confirming it in the cruelest way. Flashbacks hit me like quick, sharp punches. I remembered every moment of invisibility, every birthday where my parents had barely glanced at me, every time a family member dismissed my achievements or overlooked my presence. 12 years old, standing in the school gym after receiving a small academic award, the same dismissive shrug from my aunt, as if it meant nothing. I'm still nobody to them. And now, someone outside that pattern was seeing me, really seeing me. For the first time, I felt a strange cocktail of emotions: shock, disbelief, a flicker of pride, and an undercurrent of anger. How dare he pull this up while we're sitting here eating, like I'm some mystery to solve? Yet, part of me couldn't look away. I wanted to see his reaction, to see if he recognized what I had spent years trying to prove to no one. My sister's laugh echoed across the table, distant and warm, but it didn't reach me. My family's polite chatter continued, yet I felt like I was floating above it all, suspended in that moment. I caught a reflection of his eyes in the polished surface of the table, and they weren't judging. Not in the way my family had. No, there was something else: surprise, maybe awe, a kind of admiration that made my throat tighten and my heart stumbled. I tried to steady my hands, pressing them lightly against my thighs, reminding myself to breathe. Every second stretched painfully, electric with tension. I wanted to ask him what he'd found, to break the silence with words, but fear kept my tongue still. What if it's not what I hope it is? What if he sees the version of me they've always ignored? And yet, even with that fear, a tiny spark ignited in me, a seed of hope, fragile but undeniable. Maybe, just maybe, this one person could see me for who I truly was. Not the nobody my family insisted I was, but me. All of me that I couldn't tear my eyes away. The fiancé's phone was angled just slightly, enough for me to catch glimpses of his expression, eyebrows raised, eyes widening. A small, almost imperceptible nod as he scrolled. The rest of the room seemed to blur around him. The chatter, the clinking silverware, even the warm glow of the lights. Everything faded except for that tiny, electric shift in his attention that I started noticing subtle reactions from my family. My mother's polite smile stiffened, My father's gaze flickered briefly toward me, and my cousins exchanged small, knowing glances that carried an unspoken question. It was almost as if they realized, in that instant, that someone else was seeing me in a way they had never bothered to. The thought sent a thrill through me I didn't expect, a mixture of disbelief, caution, and a quiet, swelling pride. The smell of food and the low hum of conversation became sharper in my awareness. I could hear the soft scrape of a chair across the floor, the faint buzz of someone adjusting a napkin, and the subtle scent of perfume from across the table. Every small detail amplified the tension in the air, making it impossible to ignore how different this moment felt from all the dinners I'd survived before. I thought about the years I'd spent shrinking in my own family's presence, moments where my voice went unheard, where accomplishments were brushed aside, where even a simple hello felt like too much. And now, for the first time, I was aware that someone outside that toxic loop could see me, really see me. It was like stepping into sunlight after years of living in shadow. A flashback came unbidden. Me, 15, sitting in the corner of a crowded family gathering, quietly explaining something I was proud of, only to be interrupted and laughed at. The memory made my chest ache, but in this moment, it also made the contrast all the more powerful. This was validation, silent but undeniable, and it tasted sweeter than I could have imagined. I kept my gaze steady, trying not to show the tremor in my hands or the flutter of my pulse in my throat. Every tiny motion from him, the subtle widening of his eyes, the slight nod of approval, felt magnified, like the room was holding its breath. Part of me wanted to shrink back, to disappear and avoid the attention, but another part of me, a deeper, older part, wanted to lean into it, to savor the recognition that had eluded me for so long. That I realized then that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the nobody my family claimed I was. Someone important to my sister, someone new to this world, was witnessing the truth of me. And the feeling was both thrilling and terrifying, leaving me suspended between disbelief and quiet triumph. My heart beat loud in my own ears as I tried to steady the mix of fear, hope, and pride swelling inside me. As the dinner continued around me, my attention drifted inward, pulled into the quiet storm of memories I'd carried. For years, I watched my sister laugh at something her fiancé said, the warmth between them contrasting sharply with the cold, lingering shadows of my own family's judgments. And I realized, maybe for the first time in a long time, that I had been carrying all of this, every glance, every whispered dismissal, every moment I was told I didn't matter, as a heavy, invisible weight. I remembered the small humiliations of childhood, birthdays where my parents barely glanced at me while the other kids were celebrated, school achievements brushed aside, compliments swallowed up by casual indifference. I saw flashes of those moments in my mind, vivid and biting, like photographs I hadn't wanted to look at in years. There I was, 10 years old, clutching a ribbon from a science fair, my voice small and trembling as I tried to explain my project, only for it to be ignored. My chest tightened as if I were reliving it right there at the table. The smell of the roast and the faint perfume around me seemed distant, almost dreamlike, as I sank deeper into the reflection. The clink of silverware, the hum of conversations, even the soft glow of the dining room lights faded to a background blur. I felt the familiar ache of invisibility, the same ache that had followed me into adulthood, whispering that I was always less than, always nobody. And yet, sitting there, watching the subtle reactions to my sister's fiancé's discovery, I felt a small, stubborn ember of defiance flare to life. For decades, I had internalized their dismissals, believed their silent verdicts. But now, the quiet, undeniable attention of someone who didn't carry the weight of those judgments reminded me that maybe, just maybe, their version of me wasn't the truth. That I thought about the countless times I had measured myself against their expectations. The hours spent shrinking in social gatherings, the fear that I was always one misstep from invisibility. And suddenly, I could see how much of my own worth I had given away, how easily I had let their assumptions shape my sense of self. My hands, resting lightly on the table, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the release of something I had held too tightly for too long. A flashback struck me again. Me, 16, silently enduring a family celebration, wondering if anyone would ever notice my successes, my thoughts, my existence at all. And now, tonight, there was a glimmer, a person outside that toxic pattern, looking at me and seeing me. For the first time, the world felt bigger, lighter, like a door had cracked open that I hadn't dared to touch in years. That I exhaled slowly, the tightness in my chest loosening just a fraction. The ember of hope sparked into something warmer, more tangible. It didn't erase the years of hurt, but it reminded me that validation could come from unexpected places, and that my worth had always been real, even if they refused to see it. The moment came softly, almost imperceptibly, but I felt it ripple through the room. My sister's fiancé leaned slightly closer, his eyes bright with genuine interest as he murmured something to her, a comment that carried a weight I hadn't expected. I didn't hear the words at first. I just caught the tone, the subtle inflection that said he had discovered something impressive about me. My chest tightened in a way that was no longer anxiety, but a strange, warming flutter of quiet triumph. I forced my gaze toward him, pretending to focus on my plate, but I couldn't ignore the tiny smile tugging at my lips. For years, I had lived under the shadow of my family's low expectations, shrinking to fit the shape they wanted me to occupy. And now, here was someone, completely outside that pattern, recognizing something about me I had spent decades proving existed. The smell of roast and buttered bread seemed sharper, almost celebratory, mingling with the faint perfume lingering. In the air, the low hum of conversation faded, replaced by the rhythmic thump of my own heartbeat. I felt lightheaded, not from shock this time, but from the intensity of validation I had never thought I would experience in this setting. Flashbacks raced through my mind. Every overlooked accomplishment, every whispered insult, every subtle dismissal from my parents, my cousins, even strangers in my own home. And now, juxtaposed against those old memories, this small, unspoken acknowledgement felt revolutionary. It was quiet, almost shy, yet it carried a weight far heavier than all the judgment I'd endured. I caught a reflection of him in the polished surface of the table, eyes bright, head slightly tilted, a hint of admiration there. I realized in that instant that for someone outside my family's narrow, dismissive lens, I wasn't a nobody. I was someone worth noticing, someone whose story mattered. The realization brought an almost imperceptible tremor to my hands, a shiver of delight and disbelief that coursed through me. I felt a shift inside me, subtle but profound. My shoulders straightened, my breathing slowed, and a quiet confidence settled in my chest. I didn't need anyone to announce it aloud. The unspoken validation was enough. It was a gentle, steady acknowledgement that I existed beyond the labels, beyond the small judgments that had haunted me for so long. For a moment, I let myself revel in it, that rare, fragile joy of being truly seen. My family's murmurs and polite glances were still there, but they felt smaller, insignificant, like background noise to the quiet truth I now held. Someone saw me, really saw me, and it was enough that I noticed the shift almost immediately. The room's atmosphere, previously warm and predictable, became taut, like a string pulled too tight. My family, who had spent decades dismissing me with practiced ease, now seemed suddenly aware that someone else was paying attention to me, someone whose opinion mattered in ways theirs never had. Their smiles wavered, polite tones grew a little sharper, glances flicked nervously around the table. The sound of silverware clinking felt louder, harsher, each tap echoing like a metronome, counting out a new rhythm I hadn't expected. The faint scent of the roast mingled with tension, heavy and almost suffocating. I noticed my father's jaw tightening ever so slightly, a subtle sign of discomfort that would have gone unnoticed before. My mother's polite laughter seemed forced, edges fraying as she stole glances at me, searching for some flaw that would restore the familiar order. My cousins whispered to each other under their breath, eyes darting toward the fiancé, who remained calm, almost oblivious to the silent storm around us. It was strange to witness, watching my family, the very people who had made me feel small for so long, suddenly shrink in their own way, adjusting to a reality they weren't prepared for. Inside, I felt a quiet, simmering satisfaction. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, more like a reversal of roles I had never dared imagine. For years, they had dictated the narrative, assigning me the role of the invisible, inconsequential sibling. Now, the balance was subtly shifting. The attention wasn't mine to wield or flaunt, yet it carried a potency that was thrilling and terrifying all at once. That I reflected briefly on the countless moments I had internalized their judgments, the hours spent shrinking in my own skin to fit their mold, the humiliation, the small jabs, the constant reminders of my less than status. They had shaped me, yes, but they had never defined me completely. And now, watching them adjust to a truth they hadn't acknowledged, I felt a quiet power, a sense that the story they had written about me for so long was not the only story. The flashback flickered through my mind, a younger version of myself, sitting silently at a similar dinner, hearing polite laughter that never included me. The memory stung, but it also highlighted the contrast now, the difference between being unseen and being noticed. And this recognition, wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about reclaiming the space I had always deserved, quietly, without fanfare, simply by existing. That I shifted slightly in my chair, allowing a small, private smile to touch my lips. The tension in the room was palpable, yet it no longer frightened me. Instead, it reinforced the truth I had felt creeping into my chest since that first glance of curiosity. I mattered. I wasn't invisible. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, that realization felt powerful enough to change everything. Dinner ended with the usual shuffle of chairs, polite goodbyes, and the faint clatter of dishes being cleared. But I felt different, shifted in a way that was quiet but undeniable. The warmth of the room, once oppressive with judgment, now felt oddly comforting, almost familiar. I pushed back my chair and rose, taking a deep breath, savoring the cool release of standing after so many hours of tension. The night air hit me as I stepped outside, crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of rain that had just passed. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement, painting long, distorted shapes across the sidewalk. I let my shoulders relax for the first time that evening, feeling the tension that had coiled in my chest for years slowly unspooling. My heart was still racing, but it wasn't anxiety this time. It was a quiet, steady pulse of affirmation. I walked slowly, replaying the evening in my mind. The fiancé's subtle recognition, the shift in my family's demeanor, the flood of memories both painful and illuminating. It all felt like a delicate unfolding of a story I hadn't realized I was telling myself. For decades, I had carried the weight of being less than, internalizing every slight, every dismissive glance, every whispered judgment. And tonight, that story had cracked open, revealing a truth I had always known deep down. I mattered. The cool air smelled faintly of wet earth, mingling with the faint trace of perfume still lingering on my coat. Cars passed by, distant headlights, slicing through the darkness, and somewhere far off, a dog barked. The world felt bigger somehow, as if the simple act of being seen had expanded the space I could occupy. I realized that my family's words, their judgments, had never been the final verdict on who I was. I had allowed them to define me for too long, but tonight, that definition had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. I remembered flashes of my childhood, being overlooked, dismissed, ignored, and I smiled softly, not bitterly, but with a sense of closure. Those moments hadn't disappeared, but their power over me had faded. I had reclaimed something fundamental, my sense of worth, and it wasn't dependent on anyone else. The fiancé's attention, the subtle recognition, had simply reminded me of something I had always known, buried under years of doubt. As I reached the corner of the street, I paused, taking one last look back at the house glowing warmly in the night. I didn't feel the old weight of anxiety pressing down. Instead, I felt a quiet confidence, a gentle certainty that I could carry forward. I had walked into that dinner expecting judgment and left with clarity. I wasn't nobody. I was myself, fully and undeniably. I exhaled, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and started walking home, each step lighter than the last. The night seemed to stretch around me, full of possibilities, full of quiet victories I had earned simply by surviving, by existing, and by finally letting someone else see the real me. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, I felt whole.